My uncle never talked about the cabin. Not once. Not at Christmas dinner when the rest of the family crowded around my grandmother's table trading stories about summers up north. Not when I was a kid and asked him directly why he always drove past the turnoff to Algonquin without slowing down. He'd just look at the road ahead and say, "Nothing up there worth seeing anymore." I believed him. For 32 years, I believed him. He died on a Tuesday in late November. Massive stroke. He was 61 years old, and the only person in the room was a night shift nurse named, well, I don't know her name. The hospital called my mother. My mother called me, and I sat in my apartment in Ottawa for a long time with my phone face down on the kitchen counter, not sure what I was supposed to feel about a man I'd seen maybe a dozen times in my adult life. My uncle and I weren't close. That's the polite way to put it. The honest way is that nobody in our family was close to him. He'd pulled away from all of us sometime in my early childhood. I have a vague memory of him at a birthday party, laughing at something my dad said, and then after that, nothing. Phone calls that went to voicemail, Christmas cards that stopped coming. My mother would mention him occasionally with that particular tightness around her eyes that meant she didn't want to talk about it. The lawyer called me 2 weeks after the funeral. I didn't even know my uncle had a lawyer, which tells you something about how little I knew about his life. His name was a Mr. Leclerc, and he had an office in Pembroke, a small city about 2 hours west of Ottawa, which was itself about an hour from where my uncle had apparently been living for the past 15 years. I'd had no idea. I'd assumed he was still in Toronto. Mr. Leclerc was a short man with very precise glasses and the manner of someone who had delivered a lot of complicated news to a lot of people and had learned to do it without any particular expression on his face. "Your uncle left no spouse and no children," he said, setting a folder on the desk between us. "His estate is modest, a bank account with approximately $14,000, a 2009 pickup truck, and a property, about 40 hectares of Crown-adjacent land near Bark Lake. There's a structure on it, a cabin." I stared at him. "He left everything to you," Mr. Leclerc said, "specifically and exclusively to you. There's a note attached to the bequest. He asks that you go there before you make any decisions about what to do with it." That's it. I asked why. Why me? Why not my mother? Why not split between the family the way normal people do things? Mr. Leclerc looked at me over those precise glasses and said, "He didn't say." I drove up on a Saturday in early December, which I now understand was a terrible idea. The last 20 minutes of the drive were on an unmaintained road that had maybe seen a plow once in the past 3 weeks, and my Civic handled it about as well as you'd expect. I had to leave the car 300 meters from the property line and walk in through snow that came up past my ankles, carrying a backpack with a sleeping bag, some food, and a flashlight I'd grabbed from my kitchen drawer without checking the batteries. The batteries were fine. As it turned out, everything else about my preparation was not. The cabin sat in a clearing at the edge of what my uncle's deed described as a mixed boreal woodlot, which is a real estate way of saying tall black spruce and jack pine growing so close together that by 3 in the afternoon the whole property goes dark. The cabin itself was small. A main room, a back room that functioned as a bedroom, a wood stove that still had ash in it, and a kitchen counter with an old hand pump connected to a shallow well. No electricity. The propane tank beside the exterior wall registered about a quarter full, which was enough for the 2 burners on the camp stove inside, but not much else. It smelled like my uncle. That's the thing that stopped me in the doorway. I hadn't smelled that particular combination of wood smoke and motor oil, something I can only describe as old paper in 20 years, and it hit me so hard I had to put my hand against the doorframe to steady myself. I stood there for a while. The cold was coming in behind me, so eventually I went inside and got the wood stove going with the paper and kindling I found in a metal box beside it. I should have gone home. I know that now. It was already past 2 in the afternoon. The temperature was dropping. I had no cell signal, and I was alone in a property I'd never seen before, left to me by a man I barely knew. I should have taken a few photos, locked up, and come back in the spring with someone who knew what they were doing. Instead, I started looking through his things. My uncle was a careful man. Whatever had happened to make him pull away from the family, he hadn't become reckless about it. His papers were organized in a series of manila folders in a filing cabinet beside his desk. Tax returns going back 12 years, receipts for propane and firewood and truck maintenance, a binder full of information about the septic system. A man who kept records of his septic system is a man who expects to be around for a while. Whatever killed him, it wasn't despair. The books on his shelf were mostly Canadian history. Pierre Berton, a few academic texts about the fur trade, some local history about the Ottawa Valley, a worn paperback copy of The Edible Wild Plants of Eastern Canada that had the look of something actually used rather than decorative. I went through the bedroom. His clothes were still folded in the dresser, which was almost unbearable to look at. A pair of red wing boots by the door, a framed photograph on the small bedside table, my grandmother, young, standing in front of a lake I didn't recognize, squinting into summer sun. On the back, in her handwriting, Bark Lake, 1971. Before what? I brought the photograph back to the main room and set it on the desk and looked at it while the fire began to take the chill off the room. It was nearly dark outside by the time I started paying attention to the floor. I noticed it because I tripped on it. I'd crossed the main room maybe 15 times by then, but I was carrying an armload of firewood when my boot caught on something, and I went down hard, catching myself on the edge of the desk. The wood scattered. I swore at a volume that would have gotten me cut off at Christmas dinner. When I crouched to pick up the logs, I saw what I'd caught on, a seam in the floorboards. Not unusual in a cabin this old. The boards shift and settle over decades. But this seam was different. It ran in a perfect rectangle, about 90 centimeters by 60, and when I ran my fingers along it, the edges were smooth, not weathered, finished. I cleared everything off that section of floor. There was a small hook latch recessed into the wood, nearly invisible unless you were looking directly at it. I worked my fingers into the gap and pulled. The hatch came up smooth, recently oiled. Below it, a short wooden ladder descended into darkness. I want to describe what I felt in that moment accurately, because I think it matters. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't quite fear. It was more like that particular feeling you get when you realize a conversation you thought was going one direction is actually going somewhere else entirely. A kind of recalibration. A slow understanding that you're not in the situation you thought you were in. I pointed the flashlight down and climbed. The space below the cabin was larger than I expected. Maybe 5 meters by 4, with low ceilings I had to duck under. The walls were rough-poured concrete, which told me this had been built with intention. You don't pour concrete footings under a hunting cabin by accident. There was a shelf unit along one wall, wooden, homemade. On the opposite wall, a small metal cabinet bolted to the concrete, the kind with a combination lock. On the shelf unit there were boxes, old ones, the kind of archival boxes you see in libraries. About a dozen of them, neatly labeled in my uncle's handwriting. I took the closest one down and opened it. Inside, photographs. Dozens of them. Some old enough to be black and white, curled at the edges. Others more recent, the colors still crisp. Most of them were photographs of documents, papers, ledgers, what looked like official correspondence, shot with a camera held at an angle, the way someone takes photographs when they don't want anyone to know they're doing it. I recognized one of the faces in a photograph. Then another. I sat down on the cold concrete floor with the box in my lap, and I started to understand that my uncle had been doing something with his life that none of us had ever known about. Something that had required him to drive away from everyone who loved him and live alone in a forest for 15 years with a locked cabinet and a hidden room under his floor. And whatever it was, he'd left it to me. I didn't sleep that night. I went through every box on those shelves, and by the time the gray December light started coming through the cabin windows above me, I had a rough picture of what my uncle had been. He'd worked for a forestry company in the early 90s. That part I remembered, vaguely, from things my mother had said. What I hadn't known was that the company had been doing something they weren't supposed to be doing, something involving land surveys that didn't match the actual boundaries filed with the province, and logging contracts awarded in ways that the company's own internal auditors had raised red flags about. The archives in those boxes were 30 years of documentation. Photographs, internal memos my uncle had copied before sending them on, handwritten notes in his careful shorthand, maps with annotations. He hadn't just witnessed wrongdoing. He'd been systematically documenting it for 3 decades, hidden under the floor of a cabin in the boreal forest of Ontario. There was a letter in the bottom of the last box, in an envelope with my name on the front. My first name only, in his handwriting. I opened it. If you're reading this, I didn't get a chance to tell you myself, and I'm sorry for that. I always meant to find the right time. There never seemed to be one. What you've found is everything I've collected since 1993. I never gave it to anyone because I was never sure who to trust, and because for a long time I thought I'd live long enough to deliver it myself. I clearly overestimated my own timeline. I left it to you because you're the only one in the family I ever thought would know what to do with something complicated. Your mother would have been too frightened. Your cousins would have sold it to the wrong person before they finished reading the first box. You're stubborn enough to see it through. I'm sorry I wasn't a better uncle. I thought keeping my distance was protecting you all. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I'm not sure I was right about everything. There's a number written on the inside back cover of the Edible Wild Plants book. Call it before you call anyone else. I sat in the cold for a long time after reading that. Then I climbed back up into the cabin, found the book, and looked at the inside back cover. The number had a 613 area code, Eastern Ontario. I drove back out to where I had cell signal and sat in my car with the engine running and the heat on full and stared at it for probably 10 minutes before I dialed. A woman answered on the second ring. She sounded like she was in her 60s, her voice very steady. I was wondering when you'd call, she said. Her name was Audrey. She didn't give me a last name and I didn't ask for one. She told me she and my uncle had been in contact for about 12 years and that she worked for an organization. She was careful about how she described it, that had been waiting for the documentation my uncle had been assembling to reach a point where it could be acted on. He was very thorough, she said. What he built over those years is genuinely remarkable. What does it do? I asked. What does the documentation actually do? It establishes a chain of evidence for a series of fraudulent land transactions and improper contracts worth somewhere between $40 and $60 million, she said. Several of the people involved are still active in the provincial forestry sector. A few of them have moved into adjacent industries. I looked out the windshield at the road through the snow. What do I do with it? That, she said, is entirely your decision. I want to be honest about the part that came next, because I think it's the part people don't usually talk about when they tell stories like this. There's always this assumption that the right thing is obvious, that anyone would know what to do. I didn't feel that way. I sat with it for a week. The documentation would go to someone. Audrey had explained the process. A combination of provincial regulators, an investigative journalist she'd already been in contact with, and a specific department at the RCMP that handled this type of commercial fraud. It would take time. It might not result in criminal charges. Some of what was in those boxes was old enough that statutes of limitations were a real issue. But some of it wasn't old at all. In the meantime, I was sitting on something that certain people would very much prefer I not have. My uncle had understood that. He'd lived alone in a forest for 15 years because he'd understood it. I drove back up to the cabin twice more in those 2 weeks. The second time, I brought my girlfriend, who is a lawyer, family law, not this kind, but she has a steady head, and she went through the boxes with me for a full day and told me her honest opinion, which was that the documentation appeared genuine and that if it was, my uncle had done something significant. Why are you showing me this? She asked. Because I needed someone else to see it, I said. Because I've been walking around for 10 days feeling like I imagined the whole thing. She looked at the boxes for a moment. Then she looked at me. You didn't imagine it. I called Audrey back on a Thursday morning in early January. I told her I'd made my decision. She asked me what it was. I'll do what he wanted, I said. But I need to be part of the process. I'm not just handing boxes to strangers. There was a pause on the other end of the line. He said you'd say something like that, Audrey said. I'm not going to walk you through the entire process of what happened next, because it took 8 months, and parts of it are still ongoing, and there are things I genuinely cannot say publicly yet. What I can tell you is that the documentation was real, that the investigators who reviewed it used the word extraordinary more than once, and that as of last autumn, 2 formal provincial investigations had been opened, and a third-party audit of certain historical forestry contracts had been commissioned by the ministry. My uncle's name has not appeared in any public reporting. That was one of the conditions I set, and it was honored. I kept the cabin. I know that might seem strange. It's a 40-minute drive on a bad road from the nearest town. There's no electricity. And my back complains about the sleeping setup after about the second night. But there's something about that place that I find difficult to explain, and I've tried. My girlfriend comes up with me sometimes, and we walk the property in the mornings when the snow is still on the ground, and the light is that particular low winter gold that only happens up north. And she'll point out a bird she doesn't know the name of, and I'll pull out the copy of the Edible Wild Plants book. My uncle's copy, the one with the phone number in it, and we'll look it up together, even though it's a book about plants and not birds, because it's the book that was there, and it seems important to keep using it. My uncle spent 30 years alone with a secret that probably cost him everything he didn't choose to give away. The relationships, the ordinary life, the chance to be a person who showed up to birthday parties and knew his nephew's girlfriend's name. I don't think he was wrong, exactly, but I don't think it had to be that way. Either. I think he could have trusted someone sooner. I think he could have let 1 or 2 people in. Maybe the weight of it felt too big to put on anyone else. I understand that impulse. I spent 10 days carrying it alone before I showed my girlfriend those boxes, and 10 days was already more than enough. There was a detail in one of the boxes I haven't told you yet. In among the photographs and the memos, there was a single sheet of paper with a list of names and dates written in my uncle's hand. Some of the names I recognized from other documents in the archive. Some I didn't. At the bottom of the list, below the last entry, he had written 2 words, underlined twice. All found. I don't know exactly what that means. The investigators are still working through it, but I think about it sometimes when I'm up at the cabin, when it's quiet and the fire is going and the trees outside are making that sound they make when there's no wind and the cold is deep, a kind of settling, a slow creak, and I think about my uncle sitting in the same chair, at the same desk, building something in the dark that he believed mattered, even though he couldn't tell anyone. He was right. It mattered. I just wish I'd had the chance to tell him that myself. Would you have opened those boxes, or walked away the moment you found the hatch?